A once eradicated infectious disease is now making headlines once again. What, 31 cases in Canada as of today?
I believe we have more cases right now in 2024 than we had all last year. So it's a problem, and the measles is showing up all over Canada and probably around the world. Why? Because there's been so much concern around vaccinations in the last little while. Nobody had a concern about it necessarily, or not to this level.
Yeah.
5 years ago, before COVID.
There were like patches of it back then, thanks in no small part to erroneous and fraudulent Lancet Journal papers that have now been rescinded and that have been criminal. But the Jenny McCarthy on Oprah, that went a long way, tying the MMR vaccines, the measles, mumps, rubella, to autism in her son. That is
Debunked.
not true. It is absolutely debunked. And so we want to talk it through with someone who knows exactly what he's talking about. He has literally written a book on this stuff. He is an amazing individual, a scientist who can explain things to us in layperson's terms so we can understand what's happening. We're talking about the germ guy, Jason Tetro, microbiologist and a specialist in emerging pathogens. Hello, Jason. Good to talk with you.
It's great to be joining you again.
It's sort of like there's almost like a hydra-headed tail. On the one hand, we're seeing an alarming increase in measles cases. And then I just heard today that there's now a shortage of measles vaccines because people are now rushing to go and get it. Tell us how you see this, what's going on.
This is the same old cycle time and time again. In good times, when there's no real cases or anything like that, you see a lot of people all of a sudden going, maybe this isn't something that I need to do or I need to have my children have as a vaccine. And then sort of that anti-vaccine movement starts to grow and they get a whole bunch of momentum and then things start happening and then we start to see vaccination levels decreasing and then it comes back. And as soon as that happens, everyone's going, we need to get vaccinated right now.
Right now.
And we saw this with mumps. We've seen this with measles. We've seen this with the flu. Do you remember the pandemic flu where we had lineups that were longer than U2 concerts? I mean, that's the way it works.
Tell us what happens for those who might still be on the fence going, I'm not doing it. You can't talk me into it. I don't want the measles, mumps, rubella shot for my kid. What are they risking? What happens when a bad case of the measles hits?
Well, there's two things, okay? So the first thing is the measles case itself. So it starts about 7 to 10 days after exposure. It's a respiratory virus. You only need about one to get infected, which is why it's so incredibly contagious. And it also is airborne. It survives in the air. So you got to remember that. And then when it gets into the body, it takes about 7 to 10 days for it to start developing flu-like symptoms. And then, of course, you get that standard rash. What you don't know, okay, because most of the time people will recover, although there was a huge outbreak in Madagascar that showed about 6 out of every 1,000 people ended up dying. But it's still a lot lower than, say, what we saw with some other viruses like, Ebola, where it was 24%. But the thing is, okay, it also wipes out your immune memory. And what we've learned is that a lot of childhood morbidity, in other words, they get sick and not really happy, and mortality, they die, actually ends up happening within the 4 years after a measles infection.
Whoa.
Because they're getting infected with all these other viruses, and some of them you've already been vaccinated against, but the measles blows all of that out the water, and now you're stuck with no immunity again. And that really is the risk that no one hears about until hopefully now, and that should hopefully push you to get that vaccine.
What about adults, though? I'm pretty sure that I had my measles shots. I remember having chickenpox or measles or something, but there are a lot of adults who don't have records. You think, should I go get a measles shot?
Yeah, so if you haven't had a measles shot, obviously you want to go and get one. If you've only had one, you lose about 10% of that immunity every year. And if you've had 2 shots, well, then you start to lose your immunity about 5% per year. which means that once you start getting into your 20s and into your 30s, you may not have as much immunity as you might have had as a child. Thankfully, we have that high level of vaccination across the community that you're not really going to fall into that realm. However, there has been debate over the last 10 years as to whether or not a third shot might be needed. Now, it's not recommended unless you happen to have severe immune dysfunction. But the thing is, it's definitely something to have a talk with your healthcare provider. And if you can't find, now I'm from Ontario, so it was a yellow card, but your light blue card in BC, if you can't find that, sometimes the records might be there. But otherwise, it just might be a really good idea to have that chat and see whether it's worth, getting it, just hopefully not in the arm you throw with.
Right. So historically speaking, we were talking off the top, largely eradicated were the measles before all of this hesitancy and whatnot. How many measles vaccines have been administered globally since the discovery of that vaccine? And when I ask that question, my goal is to show that it is safe.
Well, obviously, it's somewhere in the billions. I can't give you an exact number. I don't even know if my friends over at the World Health Organization could give you an exact number. But what I do know is that in areas where we have a lower level of vaccination, as I said in Madagascar, then we end up having massive amounts. Now, before vaccination, before 1963, we were looking at about 30 million cases and 2 million deaths every single year. We saw 750 people die in one outbreak in Madagascar. Now, again, they have a very low immunization rate. However, we're already starting to see this happening in some countries that one would consider to be developed or first world, and we're starting to see deaths from measles. So the reality is that it's creeping slowly, but unless we have that cycle that I talked about off the top, and people just decide, not going to do it, we may end up actually having ourselves running into a situation where we will see more severe symptoms and we will see deaths, whether it be due to subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, I know it's a long word, SSPE, or pneumonitis, or some other virus that may actually, unfortunately, infect and radically harm someone.
Better to be safe than sorry.
Now, I'll tell you what, this was a great conversation because if you're not convinced, like you say, talk to someone who knows. Talk to a professional, talk to a doctor, and do your homework because you're putting people at risk.
And don't get your shot in your throwing arm. That's the other takeaway.
No.
Yeah.
Because it's spring.
I did that once. It hurt so much.
You got to do the chicken.
That's right. You got to do the flap.
We'll talk about that. All right,
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
It was such a pleasure. Take care.
Jason Tetro. Awesome follow on social media. Hey, later in the show, we're going to talk about another study, some research done over intermittent fasting. And people are worried for their health. We're going to talk fad diets.
Yeah, and up next, some subject close to our hearts, nursing home negligence and elder abuse. A new Canadian documentary is shining an unflattering light on the for-profit nursing home industry.
And on a fun note here with a viewing party, Joan and Victoria, you made the show, Joan.
Another one from Victoria. Hello, Gwen. Oh, hello, Gwen.
Gwen loves taking her
my
selfies.
Head down. Yeah.
Helen and Shimanis, how you doing, Helen?
And Jasmine in New Westminster. Hi, Jasmine.
You're all entered. A CHEK gift card for $100 up for grabs. Compliments of the BC RFA.